Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first GRESB Inside ESG event of 2024. This is our introduction to the new GRESB Infrastructure Development Asset Assessment, which will be available for the first time to GRESB infrastructure members from this April. Thank you to everyone for joining us live today. It looks like we've got quite a big crowd with us this morning, so welcome to you all. I'm David Thomas, Director of Infrastructure Engagement here at GRESB, and alongside my infrastructure team colleagues, we'll be spending the next hour giving you an all-access tour of our new assessment, which has been specifically designed for greenfield developments and pre-operational assets. Now, what does that mean for you? Well, for the very first time, GRESB infrastructure members will now have the opportunity to report any assets in pre-construction, construction, and in operation. This will provide assets, funds, and investors with a clearer, more comprehensive whole life cycle view of ESG performance of infrastructure assets. Now, as with any changes to the GRESB standards, the Development Asset Assessment is a result of a significant consultation and review period carried out last year by our infrastructure product team. We began that process with user interviews to collect direct feedback from the market, and this helped to shape the draft of the Development Assessment Asset Standard, which was then endorsed by the GRESB Infrastructure Standards Committee and finally approved by the independent GRESB Foundation Board. Now, a quick recap for those who aren't quite so familiar with the Foundation Board. This is the independent standard setting governing body, which is composed of representatives from GRESB members and GRESB partners, which exists to ensure that changes to the GRESB standards are continually developed, improved, and driven by the industry itself. Okay, so here's what you can expect over the next hour. Firstly, Daniel Hadari from our infrastructure product team will provide an overview of the new development asset assessment, touching on the assessment format, the topics and indicators included, and also looking at how the new assessment fits into the current GRESB infrastructure assessment structure. Following that, we are very fortunate today to be joined by Sabine Shalapin, Head of ESG Sustainable Infrastructure at GRESB member Denham Capital. Sabine kindly participated in the early stages of the development assessment, and my colleague Katie Groneman will be discussing Sabine's perspective as a GRESB infrastructure participant. Finally, we'll have a live Q&A session, and this is your opportunity to pose any development assessment questions, no matter how tricky, directly to our GRESB team. We've already received quite a few of these during the build-up to the event, so thank you very much for those. Obviously, we'd love to hear plenty more, so whilst you're watching today's event at any stage, please do provide us with any questions that come to mind, and you can put these directly into the chat box, which you'll find located in the bottom right-hand corner of your screens, and we'll do our best to address as many of those live as possible. Okay, so without further ado, Daniel, over to you to kick things off, please.
Thank you, David, for the great introduction. My name is Daniel Hadari, and I'm Senior Analyst at GRESB, working within the infrastructure team on various fronts to keep advancing the infrastructure standards yearly. And for the past year, I've been closely involved in the creation of the new Development Asset Assessment Standard, for which I have the great pleasure to present right now. Now, why a development asset assessment? To begin with, the Infrastructure Asset Standard was the only infrastructure standard targeting assets, and it targeted specifically operational assets, therefore lacking appropriate content for development assets. And this was evident as the asset assessment puts a lot of emphasis on operational data, for instance, which is lacking in development projects. This meant that it was not possible for most development projects to complete the assessment, and for those who tried, the outcomes would inevitably show only a marginal reflection of their ESG performance. Additionally, peer grouping would not be appropriate, as the benchmark would be constituted mostly of operational assets, leading therefore to a situation where there was an apparent lack of understanding of the full picture of how development assets fare in ESG terms and how they compare with each other. Member feedback, of course, as suggested by David earlier, therefore specifically required a solution for the development assets. Now, how did we fix the content then? Let's have a look at the similarities and differences really between the two assessments and how we've taken a new approach in this development asset assessment to fix the issues that I mentioned before. Many aspects of the development asset assessment mirror those of the asset assessment, as we're still looking at the same efforts required from infrastructure assets in adopting an ESG strategy, irrespective of being in development or operational. Among the aspects, therefore, that are shared across the two assessments, we have things such as leadership, which evaluates how the entity integrates ESG into its overall business strategy, looking at its ESG commitments and objectives, as early incorporation of ESG principles in project development is essential for setting up the project for success from an ESG perspective. Then we have pertinent policies and effective risk management on ESG issues that are fundamental aspects during the initial stages of project selection, planning, and design, remaining then a constant process throughout the entire project lifecycle as an aid to the asset itself in understanding and mitigating the long-term environmental, social, and climate-related impacts and risks of the asset. Then similarly, stakeholder engagement remains a fundamental process that starts from the planning stage of a project until its final disposal. And finally, data on health and safety remains crucial and has been highlighted by our own research and engagement with our governance groups, as well as a paramount indicator of projects' riskiness. And as such, data on employees is still very, very relevant. Now, while these aspects are shared across the two assessments with subtle differences for the various underlying indicators, we've taken a different approach with respect to some of the data that we used to ask in the asset assessment, which we mentioned earlier was an impediment for development projects to complete the assessment. For instance, for greenhouse gases, in the development asset assessment, we focus mostly on forward-looking information, looking specifically at net zero target setting, life cycle carbon assessment, and embodied carbon. Data points that are particularly critical and important for investors with respect to new infrastructure that is being built from scratch. When it comes to net zero, for instance, we've aligned with the IIGCC framework, whereby greenfield assets are expected to set net zero goals projected for when they will become operational, and are expected to consider in this target setting exercise also embodied carbon emissions wherever relevant and possible. In light of this, therefore, we ask, apart from just having a net zero target, also the characteristics of this target. And among the characteristics, we then investigate whether the target has taken into consideration embodied carbon emissions or what type of emission scope was used to set the target. In terms of the life cycle assessment, we ask more qualitative information, as we're asking if a life cycle carbon assessment has been carried out and the boundaries within which the assessment has been conducted. Now, examples of these boundaries could be from cradle to gate or from cradle to handover, therefore covering different cycles that can be applicable to entities depending on their own strategy towards developing new infrastructure. This can give more clarity around the methodology used to assess a project's life cycle carbon emissions, and can also shed light on the net zero target reported as well. And finally, as embodied carbon emissions are incredibly material for development projects, considering all the emissions that are generated during the production, the transportation, and the disposal of construction materials, asking for a metric on this can provide investors with an important overview of GHG emissions of a project. This metric obviously can be estimated, as we expect most infrastructure projects not to know the full figure until the asset is already well operational. Therefore, as you can see, there is no actual focus on operational data, but there is a focus more on forward-looking aspects of GHG in this case, whereas topics such as energy, water, waste, etc. are captured more qualitatively via the policies and the risk management aspects, which we touched upon before. Now, we also have new topics that have been added to this assessment, such as material selection, site selection requirements, and as well a focus on contractors' data, such as, for instance, I think of ESG training, considering the importance of the contractors' workforce to build new infrastructure and the ESG training that they need to receive. Now, realizing that not obviously all of the aspects previously mentioned in the previous slide can be applicable for all entities equally, we've taken a slightly different approach towards materiality as well, as we have introduced the concept of phase materiality, whereby an asset in development would report to GRESB the phase of development in which it sits, so whether it is in its pre-construction phase or already under construction, and these would then affect the relevance of various indicators across the previously mentioned aspects. As a result of these, we then redistribute the scores, the scoring weights across the entirety of the assessment to keep the assessment fair for everybody and to ensure the evaluation of a project's sustainability is contextually nuanced and reflective of the project's unique circumstances at any given point in its development life cycle. The diagram in this slide shows exactly how, while in the GRESB asset assessment, we can expect assets to be in their operational phase, in the development asset assessment, we can expect assets to be between two phases, these being in pre-construction or under construction. And this is taken into account in the assessment. Therefore, overall, this approach allows assets to take the development asset assessment irrespective of their development phase, and to then have the possibility to have a smooth transition towards the asset assessment, as many aspects of the development asset assessment that we touched upon before, specifically the management-related ones, remain relatively stable and aligned with the asset assessment. While once the asset turns operational, then we start to shift the focus on more operational data. Now, with the introduction of a bespoke development asset assessment, we've got a series of benefits that were simply not available before for development assets. Among these, we have benchmark reports, both for assets and funds. Being this a new and separate assessment, development projects participating in it would create their own benchmark and receive their own benchmark report with their own GRESB score, in this case, a GRESB development score, with peer grouping comparisons and asset level data information. Similarly, funds with underlying assets participating in the development assessment would then receive their own fund development score with as well peer grouping information with respect to their development projects and portfolio aggregated data on key metrics such as health and safety, which we touched upon previously. We also, as with all assessments, we then would have usable asset level data, as participants and investors would then be able to have access to asset level data and extract such data for any analysis that they might need to conduct. The importance of third-party validated data is still captured in the development asset assessment. Just like its asset assessment sister, it is subject to third-party validation with respect to certain indicators, meaning that the data submitted will go through a process of external validation. And as explained before, the assessment is designed so that assets in different phases can still take the assessment without being penalized, and therefore fairly reflect their ESG commitments and performance overall. Finally, grouping all of these together, participating in GRESB allows any fund manager and infrastructure company to connect and enhance communication with investors over ESG issues, as GRESB has an online community of investors in its portal that can request access to the generated benchmark reports that come from the development asset assessment. We therefore can enhance communication with investors on ESG issues in a time when ESG considerations in the development phase of a project can not only broaden the pool of potential investors, but also convey integrity of the asset from an ESG perspective at least, and allow investors to assess the risks associated to development projects early on. Now, good things to know about this assessment. Well, first of all, the development asset assessment is a separate assessment from the asset assessment. In fact, entities will be able to choose to take either one or the other assessment. And the image on the right simply shows how the interface would look for those asset entities that want to submit to the GRESB assessment, where they will be asked to choose between one or the other assessment. Therefore, the development assessment falls within the overall GRESB infrastructure assessment offering, and I will show better how this whole family sort of fits in at the end of the presentation. Participants can still opt in for the grace period if they wish not to disclose their scores, apologies. And then participants can make use of a templating tool to alleviate the reporting burden of having to submit the same information potentially across different entities for the same indicators. Important thing to know is that resources can be found already in the landing page of the development asset assessment at GRESB.com. And among the resources available, we have the GRESB materiality and scoring tool, which is a great tool to see how the materiality we spoke about before, affects the reporting entities' indicators and the relevance of various ESG issues. Then we have the GRESB Development Asset Assessment Reference Guide, which explains in detail what type of evidence we expect participants to submit, how the various indicators are structured, and appendices with relevant information regarding the reporting period process. And finally, the GRESB Development Asset Assessment Scoring document, which then explains in detail how each indicator scoring logic works. And finally, from a fund's perspective, funds will still be able to exclude assets in development from feeding into their GRESB score, at least for the first year of this assessment. So that will now mean that if a fund does not want to receive the new fund development score, it can do so by simply excluding the asset, while the asset can still participate in reporting to GRESB and making use of the development asset assessment. To conclude, I wanted to show to everyone, as I mentioned earlier, and illustrate how all the infrastructure assessments fit in together. Now, from a fund perspective, funds will take the fund assessment and connect to their underlying assets, which will now be able to choose whether to take the asset assessment or the development asset assessment. As such, a fund now will be able to have, apart from a GRESB score, also a GRESB development score, which is based on its underlying assets taking the development assessment. This is always dependent on having at least 25% of the GAV-weighted portfolio reporting to GRESB. Therefore, if this threshold is not met, then the scores of the underlying assets are not aggregated at the fund level. Additionally, 30% of the GRESB score and the GRESB development score of funds still depends on the fund assessment submission in itself, and 70% instead of the score will depend on the underlying assets assessments results. At the asset level instead, as explained before, assets in development will be able to take the newly introduced assessment and receive a distinct benchmark report with its own development benchmark, with its own development score, and PIN grouping and asset level data information. Thank you very much for your attention. And now, without further ado, I will pass the word to Katie and Sabine.
Thanks, Daniel. That was really great to hear, and I'm sure everyone has been waiting with bated breath for the development asset assessment. And I know one person who's in that group is Sabine. So Sabine, thank you so much for joining us today. Sabine is the head of ESG at Denim, focusing on sustainable infrastructure. And Sabine, I think I've been with GRESB for 4.5 years. And since the start of my joining GRESB, I've had conversations with you around development assets. So I'm really grateful that you're here today and willing to share some thoughts. So I'll hand over to you for a minute so you can tell a little bit about what you do at Denim and what Denim does around sustainable infrastructure. And then I have a couple of questions for you. So thank you again.
Sure. Good morning, and it's great to be participating in this webinar. So Denim Capital is a private equity firm investing in global energy infrastructure, and I work specifically for the sustainable infrastructure team, which manages a portfolio of clean energy generation assets. So we have one fund, the Sustainable Infrastructure Fund 1, which has been participating in GRESB for maybe about 5-6 years now. And I remember when I first looked into GRESB and I actually came to Amsterdam and went to the offices, I remember one of my key questions was, why do you not cover development assets? So for a fund like ours, actually the majority of our portfolio is our assets under either development or construction, and a very small portion is operational assets. And I just felt that there was a gap which was not being covered for that time.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe I've just, in my enthusiasm, also neglected to introduce myself. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm sure if you've seen a webinar with GRESB before, you may have seen me, but my name's Katie Graneman. I sit in the member relations team at GRESB, and that's why I know Sabine so well, because I've been talking to Sabine about this for a while, as mentioned. And so, Sabine, I think one of the difficulties, and that kind of related to it taking a while to get this assessment started, is around approaching ESG in the development phase, because it is quite different from the operational part of it. There's different things to consider. There's different approaches that are necessary. What is some of the key things that you focus on at Denim around ESG and development, and sort of what isn't really covered maybe in the current operational asset assessment that's kind of missing there?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the key things is really site selection, right? And doing the assessments at a development phase to identify environmental and social risks. So they might be, for example, biodiversity risks, or they might be risks related to the community. The challenge is once you have an operational project, you can't change. If you've impacted biodiversity and if you've impacted the community, there's only so much which you can do to resolve the situation. And I think it's really critical to look at the development stage, how you can minimize any negative impacts and how you can maximize positive impact. So the early stages of identifying a project, looking at the environmental and social risks of that project and the opportunities is really important, because then you can put in place measures and policies, or you might have to think about putting the project somewhere else because those risks are just too big and you're not comfortable in managing them.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's also what makes ESG in the development phase such a crucial thing to consider, right? Because you're building these assets and you're not going to be demolishing them in 5 years' time. They're going to be there for the long haul. So starting with ESG from the get-go is really crucial in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, infrastructure assets, just by their very nature, are long-term assets. So they generally have, over 20, 30 years lifespan. So it's really important to get it right at the beginning. Yeah.
For sure. And so obviously there are some things that are definitely crucial around ESG, but that can also be quite challenging to collect in terms of monitoring and doing your due diligence. So what do you reckon would be a limitation that you currently have on trying to sort of make an impact on ESG during that development phase?
Yeah, I mean, I think so I think there's both the development and the construction phase, right, which
Yes.
are nearly two slightly different phases. And the challenge, I think, especially during the construction phase, is that things are happening so quickly. So, 3 months down the line, your project's going to look very different to what it looked at the beginning. And it's being able to track what's going on, doing kind of week by week, month by month, and getting data. I mean, I think key to ESG now is data and being able to track data throughout a process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where hopefully the development asset assessment will come in very nicely. And I think also part of the reason why GRESB has decided to sort of split between the pre-construction phase and the construction phase for those development assets. So you're still completing the same assessment, but at least there's a difference in terms of focus for assets that are already in that construction phase with different indicators becoming material and becoming scored. So that's something hopefully that's going to sound quite positive to a lot of people as well. Now, bridging the little gap towards, we have this development asset assessment. How are you planning to use that at Denim? And of course, I appreciate that you have some confidentiality limitations. So if you're able to share anything, we'd love to hear it.
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, it's really important to have kind of the history of the asset and to have the information. Especially when you're starting to look at exiting investments, you want to be able to show a potential buyer the whole history from development to construction to operational, because they're going to ask the question. So it actually helps in the due diligence process, having that all on track and having that a regular report and being able to show that to potential buyers. Yeah, so I think that's one of the key areas. Also, I think it's learning, right? So even on the reporting on the operational assets, I've learned so much through going through the process that you can share those learnings with other assets. And I think that's really cross kind of training is so valuable between assets. There might be different geographies, different asset types, but there's key things which you can learn through the process of going through it, which you can share then with, other asset developers.
Absolutely. It's almost like, and I think that's really where a standard like GRESB can make a big difference as well. And that's what I frequently tell our members as well is, when you're starting off with ESG and so for sometimes in some jurisdictions, especially, that's a very novel thing. It's not necessarily the case that everyone is dreaming sustainability yet. And having a sort of common ground to talk about it, and having an assessment where you can say, hey, these are topics that are covered in the assessment, so let's talk about that. Let's start a dialogue. And maybe not everything's in place, right? So maybe some things need to be built up. Some things are maybe already there. Some things may come more naturally than others. But it's almost like you have this sort of starting point where you can at least start to find that common ground.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, we've invested a lot in emerging markets. And actually, what has surprised me is actually a lot of the assets, they do have that information, they do have the data, but it might be sitting in different departments, and it's trying to bring it together. So it's a really good exercise of getting a team around a table and saying, you know, what's your diversity, equity, inclusion policy? What's your greenhouse gas data? And bringing this all together under one report.
Yeah, for sure. And it creates sort of insights for the asset. It creates insights for the fund manager. It creates for other institutional investors who are sort of sitting beyond that in the financial ecosystem. So I think having more information is always good in overcoming those sort of limitations and challenges that we have. And I think it's also good to sort of bear in mind, and I wonder what your thoughts on this are, is that especially when you're starting off, and I can imagine this might be the case for assets in emerging markets where maybe regulation hasn't sort of driven assets to already do certain top things around ESG, that, you know, it's not so difficult in some ways to get started, but then, you know, building the momentum and keeping that momentum can be a bit difficult. So how do you find that?
Yeah, so Denham Sustainable Infrastructure, we've always required our portfolio companies to develop projects to the IFC performance standards. So that has really helped in terms of elevating those projects, in terms of the organizational capacity around ESG and the amount of training which we do, and making sure that there are teams in place. So although in some countries the regulation may not be as strict as, for example, we have either in Europe or in the US, having that IFC performance standards helps to bridge that. But then it's taking it nearly to the next level up, right? So that having those assets being able to compete on ESG with maybe more assets in more developed markets which have experience and knowledge, and being able to show actually that they're doing pretty well.
Exactly. And sometimes it's like what you say, right? There's things already being done. It's just not necessarily been centralized,
Exactly.
Which makes it, not so obvious, but actually there's quite a lot going on already.
Yeah, absolutely. I also think with GRESB, and I always say this to our portfolio companies, you know, I know there's sometimes quite a lot of pressure to get a really good score, but I actually think it's a really helpful learning curve, right? I don't expect assets to be like scoring super well right at the beginning, because you learn through the process and you can see where you maybe have done less well one year and put in place, you know, improvements to score better the next year. So I really think it's a journey. You know, you shouldn't expect to have the amazing scores right from the beginning.
Absolutely. It's a bit like, and that's again another comparison I'd like to make. It's, you know, you've decided you want to go on a road trip. You're based in London. You've decided you want to go to the south of France. You kind of know roughly in which direction you have to go, but it's still helpful to have a guide that tells you, okay, this is the route you should take. Oh, this is a nice scenic route where you're going to, you know, maybe be able to stop by at a nice little restaurant and have some nice French food on the way. And you know, trying to sort of, and have that guide evolve every year as well. And that's a little bit what we're trying to do with GRESB, although maybe we offer less gourmet food on the way. Maybe this is something we should consider for future years. I think, Daniel, if you're listening in, introducing food into the assessments, let's think about it. Great. Sabine, thank you for sharing this. And one last thing I sort of want to cover as well, maybe a little bit, not necessarily something it's a bit more of a high level question, but how do you sort of see that developing over the next couple of years around ESG in the, especially in that sort of pre-construction and construction phase? How do you sort of see the trends that are emerging? Obviously, the development asset assessment is the first step in that direction, but I'm sure that will also evolve over time.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we've seen in the last couple of years, and I just expect that to grow exponentially, is data. Everyone's asking for ESG data. So we have, we're a fund, but I see our investors asking us for, you know, specific ESG data on projects, and that kind of high quality data which is verifiable, I think that's just the trend, which is where it's going to go. So I think being able to start tracking it, reporting it is really important.
Yeah, it's the wheels on the car for the road trip. You need a sound carriage to get you there, and it doesn't matter if it's the shiny one just yet. But get started, get the wheels in place, and you can get going. Oh, great. Thank you so much, Sabine. That was really, really insightful, and hopefully also insightful to everyone who's attending. Now, we'll stick around for a minute because we have a Q&A as well. So I will re-invite Daniel and David to come back. And I think we have some questions that were pre-submitted. So David, I'll pass over to you as you'll be moderating, and then just cue us in if you need any answers from us.
Absolutely, and I will. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Sabine. That was great. So as Katie just mentioned, we've had quite a few questions come through in advance of today's webinar, and I can see a few coming through live as well, which is great. So let's get stuck into it. And I think, Daniel, probably this first one is coming to you, as many of these might do. So for our first pre-submitted question, looking at are assets that are under development expected to complete the infrastructure development asset assessment and then transition to the existing infrastructure asset assessment once they're operational?
Great question. Thank you, David. Yeah, I mean, I would say that once assets in development transition from being developed to operational, the associated entity in the GRESB portal should take the asset assessment. The entity would remain the same, while the type of assessment that is undertaken differs. This, anyways, does remain the choice of the participant, but nevertheless, it would make sense for an operational asset to then be benchmarked against other operational assets and scored against indicators that target more operational assets in general. So yeah, to just give a final answer, yes, that would be the expectation, to transition from the development asset assessment into taking the asset assessment once the asset becomes operational.
Great, thank you. And sort of sticking with the structure type question here, we've had one which has come through on the live chat slightly related to this, so maybe we'll go to this one next, which is does the asset assessment and the development asset assessment make up the performance score, and is this separate to the management score?
I think this question is more at the fund level, if I understand correctly. So maybe to just reiterate, from a fund perspective, we have a fund that has a management score, and at the moment a performance score as well. Now, the management score is based on the fund assessment itself, and the performance score instead is dependent on the underlying assets of the fund that take the asset assessment. These are two separate scores that, once merged together, they make up what is known as the GRESB score for the fund. Now, with underlying assets having the ability to take also the development asset assessment, funds will also have a development score as an additional score, and which link together with the management scores, management plus development, then they would have the new GRESB development score for funds. So basically, we have management plus performance and management plus development at the fund level. I believe this question is targeting funds.
Thanks, Daniel. And I suppose actually, as a sort of a third part to this, and just a sort of a bit of extra clarification, we had one of the pre-submitted questions, which is wanting us to address what approach to the GRESB assessment might a company take that has both established operations as well as a program of greenfield development sites. And I think this is probably going to be a case which is pertinent to quite a few new participants this year.
Yes, so here you can take different approaches, really. There's the first approach, I would say, which is simply splitting the entities between the pre-operational ones and the operational ones. And therefore, it's recommended to take two different assessments for those entities that are pre-operational and for those that are operational. And ideally, these will be split depending on geographical location and also sector. Now, this is not always possible. We know that there are potentially assets that the way they report to GRESB, they report as an infrastructure company, so with grouped assets. And instead, for grouped assets, it is still possible to report to simply the asset assessment and report all of the grouped assets and mark those grouped assets that are still in development as greenfield and exclude them from the reporting boundaries of the asset assessment. So these are the two options at the moment. So it's either splitting the entities per geographical location and sector, and then taking one asset assessment and one development asset assessment, or keeping the structure as is now, which is having grouped assets together in one assessment, but just making sure to report which are the ones that are greenfield and exclude them from the reporting boundaries of the asset assessment.
Great, thanks for that, Daniel. It's probably worth mentioning as well, just as a general point, that obviously when it comes to the structure of the assessments, all of that detail is available on the GRESB website as well. Now, this is a question, I suppose, that we've had on numerous occasions over the years as well, but obviously specifically to the development assessment in this case, and that is looking at how will the assessment account for vastly different sizes of infrastructure assets?
Yes, this is a great question that we get, I think, quite recurrently. The assessment uses, well, first of all, sector materiality to consider the variety of infrastructure sectors that exist out there. Now, the sector materiality that we have in the development asset assessment has been taken actually from the asset assessment, which in turn was developed in consultation with, at the time, the Infrastructure Advisory Board and GRESB collaborating together, and it keeps being updated on a regular basis based on member feedback. And the reason why we've copied across that sector materiality from the asset assessment to the development asset assessment is because the sector materiality of the development asset assessment affects material outcomes of certain ESG issues only in design risk assessment indicators, wherein entities are expected to carry out a forward-looking risk assessment of their ESG risks. That means that they have to take into consideration the risks and the impacts throughout the life cycle of the asset, and therefore the same materiality, the same sector materiality, can be applied from the asset assessment into the development one. Additionally, though, as we explained during the presentation, we have other layers that instead we've added to the development assessment, such as phase materiality due to the different phases of assets, to distinguish better between pre-construction and construction assets.
Thanks, Daniel. And I think we're going to transition slightly now to look at how the assessment actually aligns sort of externally as well. So we had a question coming in here. Is the development asset assessment equivalent to an environmental certification, such as a scheme like BREEAM?
Well, the good question. The GRESB development asset assessment has been developed obviously by having a look, first of all, at our offerings. So having a look at the asset assessment, having a look at the real estate development component, for instance, and then having a look at international frameworks, such as actually BREEAM infrastructure projects, but also the IFC performance standard. So it has been aligned to those international frameworks that target specifically development projects, but it is not equivalent to BREEAM. And the reason for it, I would say, is because, first of all, apart from focusing on environmental topics, it focuses obviously also on social and governance topics. And participating in GRESB comes with all the benefits that we've explained before, which is not just completing a standard, but it's also having then a benchmark to compare against, having peer grouping insights, having a GRESB score to understand how you're doing, trend-on-trend analysis, and all the vast gamut of benefits that you get from participating in GRESB. So it has been obviously constructed and developed by looking at international frameworks, but it's not the same as simply following a standard. It's much more than that.
Great, thank you. And again, I think when we sort of put together the logic around the methodology for the development asset assessment, there was a sort of a clear structure there in place, which is detailed as well in the documentation on the specific webpage for the development asset assessment on the GRESB website as well, if you'd like to take a closer look at that. Okay, so getting into a little bit more detail here and looking at exactly how, again, members can sort of utilize pre-existing data within the GRESB system when applying to the new assessment itself. We had a further question submitted asking, is it possible to transfer data, documents, and answers from the previous asset assessment submission through to the new development asset assessment? And perhaps, Daniel, you can take that piece first, and there's sort of a second piece to this question as well afterwards.
Yeah, well, okay, so taking the first piece, I would say that the transfer of data across assessments, so from the asset assessment to the development asset assessment, it's not currently available. But of course, if you require assistance on these, I would definitely advise to get in touch with GRESB through the GRESB help desk, and we can definitely see ways to help out participants who might actually require this.
Great, thanks. And on the second point coming through here, what are the main differences between the asset assessment and the new development asset assessment in relation to companies active solely in pre-construction activities?
Yeah, this is actually exactly where phase materiality comes into play, actually, because in the development asset assessment, phase materiality allows companies solely active in pre-construction activities to still complete the entire assessment and receive a GRESB development score and be part of a GRESB benchmark, a development benchmark. The reason for it is because we basically ask participants if they are in pre-construction or in construction, and depending on that answer, we then apply this layer of materiality whereby certain indicators become material or not. Therefore, I would say that one of the main advantages of the development asset assessment is that it allows companies to benchmark against other development companies in the same phase. So if someone is solely focused on pre-construction activities, it will be able, given that the benchmark is big enough, to then compare itself against only companies that are focused solely on pre-construction activities.
Great, thanks, Daniel. Thanks very much for that. We'll give you a little bit of a breather here because I realise you've just been bombarded for the past few minutes. So, Katie, if I can switch over to you for one of the live questions that we've just had come in. If there are no construction projects in the fund, how will the development component score affect the overall result?
Yeah, thanks for that. So the beauty of the structure that we're introducing is that there will be no penalty whatsoever. So if you're, as a fund, only have performance, so in other words, you only have operational assets that are linked to your fund and reporting to GRESB, then you will only have a performance score. So you won't have a development score. And so, there's no penalty or anything for not having development, and vice versa. So if you have a fund that focuses exclusively on development, doesn't do any operational assets, you will get that development score, you will get your overall combined score, but you won't be penalized for not having operational assets, because that would be a bit silly. That'd be saying like, oh, you've not developed anything, you're terrible, points subtracted, that would be unfair. So to sum it up, yes, there's no penalty.
Thank you, Katie, very clear. And Daniel, coming back to you, quite a specific question here, around for the health and safety indicators, is it sufficient to disclose only the data in the green shaded area of the table to obtain the total score for the indicator? And perhaps you could just clarify exactly what's meant there by the green shaded area of the table, just for those who are less familiar.
Yeah, definitely. So the tables that relate to the health and safety indicators, they're pretty similar to the ones in the asset assessment, actually, as we mentioned, is one of those aspects that is pretty similar. Due to the importance of the same data point being collected also for development projects. And to basically complete these tables, you need to report, first of all, the mandatory metrics. These mandatory metrics are metrics that in the reference guide, but also in the tool, in the assessment portal, are basically highlighted with a dark green. And these metrics are fatalities, lost time injuries, total recordable injuries, and hours worked. And based on these reported metrics, then the shaded metrics that have been asked, they are automatically calculated. So first you report on the mandatory metric, and then the shaded metrics get automatically pre-filled basically after you've reported the mandatory metrics. And yes, once those are pre-filled, that's what matters for the score. It's having those shaded green shaded tables, let's say, filled with data.
Very good, thank you. We've had an interesting one just come through here, actually, sort of speaking to, I suppose, a slightly wider issue within this, and that's looking at, this person has asked, often the development planned does not happen. So is there a danger here of greenwashing? I don't know if anyone would like to put their hand up to have a stab at that one.
I can get started, and then Daniel, you can weigh in if you want to as well. I think look, the reality is that we're not the police and we're not regulators. If you really want to be a terrible person and fill out a bunch of nonsense, like we have means to check some of your information, but we are not coming to your site and doing a full audit, right? So greenwashing in the most how do you say that evil sense of the word, there's always a possibility. I think what the GRESB assessments are about the spirit of ESG in the sense that we expect financial market participants to be honest about their ESG performance and disclosure. If a development starts and they participate in the GRESB assessments, just participating in GRESB does not mean that you are doing really well as an asset or that you're doing very poorly if you don't participate. It's more a means to communicate what you're doing, and we expect you to share the right information that comes as part of that. If the development happens to fall through, so maybe after the pre-operational phase, it gets decided that it's not a feasible project, or for whatever reason, something cannot continue, then yes, the asset will cease to exist, if you will, and stop participating in GRESB. So the danger of greenwashing is, in my opinion, not necessarily there, other than what we have for the operational asset assessment already. I see Daniel nodding, so I'm hoping he agrees with what I've just said.
Yeah, no, it's a pretty comprehensive answer. And I would also add that in our indicators, both in the asset assessment and the development asset assessment, we do carry out basically third-party validation, right? So we do check that the documents that have been uploaded. So for instance, if you're doing a right risk assessment, we do check that is the case. Now, again, whether, as Katie was mentioning, whether the development then goes as planned or not, this can be due to multiple factors, right? It could be also due to business risk, and it just the business plan did not go as planned. And that doesn't necessarily have to do much with ESG. Obviously, there could be also be ESG controversies that stop a development project, right? But for that, we also have indicators that target that, and we ask if there have been any ESG controversy. Now, that still depends on the participants reporting the data, of course. But I would say that this is more of a conversation across all assessments, not just the development one.
Maybe I can also chip in. So as an investor, I think if you see a development asset which is not going through, there's a conversation which you can have with the company which is developing the asset to understand why it's not going through. So actually, I think it's an opportunity to have that conversation and provides information as well, for an investor to come in and understand what the challenges have been.
Great,
Yeah,
thanks all for that.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead, David.
No problem at all. And I think we've got a sort of a couple more practical questions, if I can call them that. Actually, before we get to that, we've had one more come in on the live feed here, which is an interesting one. So on a macro level, would the same criteria apply to nature-based infrastructure? Daniel, perhaps you can lead with
I think I can take that one. So we have in the development asset assessment, we have obviously a variety of sectors that we capture. At the moment, for nature-based infrastructure, I don't think we have a specific sector, but we capture information on biodiversity via policies and risk assessment. But it is an area that we still need to explore. And it was, I think, part of our plans actually to capture better nature-based solutions, as well as they will become always more relevant in building new infrastructure. So I would say it's slightly captured in a way through certain indicators, but not fully. So that is work that is in progress, I would say.
Great. Thank you, Daniel. So Katie, back into your ballpark here with a couple more practical questions. The first one, which came through live, is there training required to know how to work on indicators used to fulfill the asset?
Training required. So it's helpful to know what E, S, and G stand for, I think, when you start GRESB, but that's very easy to look up and to learn if you don't know already. So I think in terms of training, it's really up to how deeply you want to get into the material. The reference guides are pretty detailed. So the information that Daniel and the rest of his team put together has also a lot of information around how to approach indicators, the rationale behind indicators, what the different terminology within the indicators means, references towards external frameworks where applicable. So there's quite a lot there. If that's not sufficient, we have training videos that I believe will be up before the 1st of April on the development asset assessment as well. So those continuously get updated by our member success team. And if that still leaves you puzzled and you're not sure where to go, we have a fantastic customer support team, our member success team behind the scenes. So you can always contact them at info. I would always recommend doing that if you can.
Thank you. And I think we've probably got time just for this last one now. In a similar vein, Katie, from a sort of a practical perspective, is the development asset assessment a separate assessment to be paid extra, or is it part of the GRESB assessment offering?
It is a separate assessment to be paid extra for. The reason for that is because, as Daniel mentioned, we still do validation on every assessment. So we have a cost that we need to cover as GRESB. So there is a payment required. However, because this is the introductory year, we have introductory pricing and discounts. So talk to your local member relations or sales contact if you want to understand the pricing for that. So we have some offers available. And we're always happy to have a chat. Great,
thank you very much. And yeah, I think we've managed to work our way through all of those this morning. So yeah, thank you all for your engagement and contributions today, and a special thanks obviously to Sabine for joining us to provide that key insight from a participant perspective as well, and obviously to Daniel and Katie for working through all those questions. If you did happen to miss any of today's session, the full webinar will shortly be available on demand on the GRESB website, and you should be able to find the link to that in your email. As always, the GRESB team is here to help and provide guidance as you work through, so please do get in touch with any additional questions. And for me and the rest of the team, we look forward to speaking with you very soon. Thank you.
Thanks.